and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. John Tobin will be joining us in a moment for the UFO news of this week. Well, tomorrow is the 17th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights mass sighting that happened back in 1997. And our guest today is Jim Dilettoso, and he's one of the very first investigators of what I consider to be on my short list while I'm debating UFOs. Before we get started on anything, we have this week's astronomy clip with Andy Fleming right now.
And hello, Martin and listeners. Today's podcast UFO astronomy segment carries on from last week's chat about Kepler and exoplanets. It's about astrobiology, which is the study of life elsewhere in our universe. And it's another controversial subject because conventional scientific wisdom is that we haven't found any life beyond the Earth, i.e. our life, that is life 1.0. The search for life 2.0 on those millions of other worlds we know exist requires an understanding of life here on the Earth and the nature of the environments that support it. We also need to fully understand planetary science and astrophysics. Astrobiology thus combines the resources of many other fields, including astronomy, biology, chemistry, geology, atmospheric science, oceanography, and aeronautical engineering. Practitioners are often from different scientific disciplines, but work together to examine complex questions that no one field can answer alone. These questions cover topics such as: how does life originate? How does life evolve? What kind of environment is necessary for life to survive? And what are the environmental limits or extremes under which life can survive? What might life look like on another world? Is there or has there been life elsewhere in our solar system? How can we observe and identify a habitable or even inhabited world? And what is humanity's future on Earth and beyond? Now, astrobiological research has a significant impact on how agencies such as NASA and ESA plan for future space missions. Past initiatives have focused on exploring our own solar system for signs of past, present, or the precursors of life, with targets including Mars, Europa, and Saturn's moon, Titan. Simultaneously, advances in telescope technology have allowed researchers to begin searching for habitable planets outside our own solar system. And therein lies what may be the ultimate irony. It could well be that life 2.0 will not be initially found within our own solar system at all, but around a world orbiting another star. And it will be done not by spacecraft with all the budgetary, political and technical baggage they bring. It'll be done by the next generation of huge ground-based telescopes that are about to come online. By concentrating on planets that are reasonable Earth analogues, that is, those with fairly similar masses to our own planet, orbiting fairly similar stable stars, and within their solar system's habitable zone, astronomers can utilize their most important life-detecting tool, light. One of the macro biosignatures of life, detectable from huge distances, is the presence of large amounts of free oxygen in a planetary atmosphere. Now, oxygen constantly needs to be replenished via photosynthesis from green plants. Without plants, all of the Earth's oxygen would be locked up in rocks as it is today on Mars. It is extremely chemically active. An oxygen-rich atmosphere detected by a process called spectroscopy would just about nail the issue. The final icing on the cake would be free methane coexisting with that oxygen. Without plants, organisms and rotting vegetation, that is life 2.0, there is no possibility of free oxygen allowing free methane to exist, except for exceptionally short periods of time.
So that was Andy with our astronomy for this week. And now it's time for the UFO News with John Tobin. How are you, John?
Hey, Martin. Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be back here in the whatever hemisphere the North America here is.
Yes. And, I don't detect any Irish accent at all. How was your time over there?
It was fantastic. I believe I left my horrible Irish accent in the last pint of Guinness I had at the pub.
Oh, I see. It didn't go over too well over there, huh?
No. It's kind of like their American accents, which were actually worse than my Irish accent, if you could believe that. And mine was pretty bad.
Oh, I love hearing when, another country that has quite a different accent than ours tries to do an American accent. It's always funny.
It's funny, but when it's a guy, it always sounds like John Wayne for some reason.
Okay. Hey, so what's going on with the news this week?
Well, there's some really cool news this week, actually, some kind of interesting stuff. One of them is, if you ever wanted to be a gas jockey in space. Now, what does that mean? Well, Science Daily reports that future lunar missions may be fueled by gas stations in space, according to engineers. A spacecraft might dock at a propelled depot somewhere between the Earth and the Moon and pick up extra rocket fuel before making its way to the lunar surface. Orbiting way stations could reduce the fuel a spacecraft needs to carry from Earth, and with less fuel on board, a rocket could launch heavier payloads such as large scientific experiments. For the full story on that, please click on the link in our show notes, and that'll bring you to the source story of the full information on that interesting story.
Yes, I've heard of similar things along the lines that, they should be working from space with all kinds of things that can develop out in space when they don't have to worry about, gravity or anything. And so this kind of goes along with that.
Yeah, I would think that a lot of these types of experiments would certainly actually technically be easier with the gravity, as far as large equipment and the ability to move it around and work with it.
That's right. So what else is going on?
Well, I've got some information here on the loss of good old-fashioned flying saucers, as reported by Lee Spiegel. Whatever happened to those good old-fashioned circular saucers? Well, accounts of them continue to show up in police reports, newspapers, YouTube, etc. It seems like these days there are more and more sightings and videos of triangular UFOs, V-shaped, Dorito-shaped, and unidentified objects. The earliest known reports of these unusual triangles can be traced to the Dutch East Indies in the late 1890s, around 10 years prior to the Wright brothers' first powered airplane flight. Triangle UFOs were reported from Scotland and England in 1895. So...
There's probably triangular swamp gas or something.
It could be.
That's right, yeah. I agree with this, though. There is so many more reports of the triangular UFOs, and, they all are pretty similar. A lot of them, a lot of times they talk about these, like, sort of orange, amber glowing lights that aren't really lights. They're hard to describe. And, the formation, and they always seem to be huge, and, no sound. You hear that over and over and over again. Enough, to certainly wonder where all the flying discs are.
And an unrelated story, though, I did want to mention, I did read the first Dorito-shaped UFO was actually discovered by Cheech and Chong, just for the record.
All right. Pulled that out of the archives somewhere.
Pulled that out of the archives. You can look that up. It's true.
Yeah.
Anyway, moving along, Moon River. Moon River, not the song, however. NASA's plotting a daring robotic mission to Jupiter's watery moon, Europa, a place where astronomers speculate there may be some form of life. The space agency set aside $15 million in its 2015 budget proposal to start planning some kind of mission to Europa. No details have been decided yet, but NASA Chief Financial Officer Elizabeth Robinson said Tuesday that it would be launched somewhere in the mid-2020s. What do you think of this, Martin?
Well, Europa is one of those fascinating moons, and, there's speculation that the ice could be up to a couple of miles thick, and just the possibility with the amazing gravity of Jupiter that it could be actually warm inside. The way it's kind of hard to. It's kind of like when you knead dough for bread. It heats up warm. So there could be enough warmth in the ocean underneath the ice to actually support some type of life, a possibility. The only way they can really get to it is to do some type of probe that would drill, the 2 miles down or whatever, however thick that ice really is. And
when we think of life on other planets of any type, we think of planets, I should say, not the moons. So hearing this story, possibilities, really opens up a whole other, how many other moons out there have these possibilities? I don't know. We've got some other interesting news that's very timely, actually, with the current Russian invasion and the conflict, I should say, in the Ukraine. Apparently, not just Russia is invading the Ukraine. MSN reported that a huge cigar cylinder-shaped UFO was videotaped hovering over the Ukraine during Russia's invasion of Crimea, something like that nature. There is the video in our show notes, which is pretty cool. If you check that out, Martin.
Oh, yes. The cigar-shaped ones, I personally talked to a gentleman from Russia that didn't even speak English. It was translated to me. He was telling me his whole story, and basically it was exactly the same thing. He said it was a long cylinder like a cigar and went through the mountain pass, and when it did, all the cars stalled. Everybody got out of their car, and this thing went right over them. And then as soon as it got out of range, all the cars started right back up. It was quite a story.
That's really strange. It's funny when the different types, we talked about triangular and Dorito-shaped and cigar-shaped UFOs, all the different shapes, so many of the reports that come out about these are so similar. And many people from all different places that see them describe almost exactly in different languages the same things.
That's right. So, you can think maybe, the discs come from one planet, the cigar shapes from another, and the Doritos from a cheesy moon, maybe. I don't know.
I'm going to go Dorito planet.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much, John.
Anytime. Look forward to talking to you next week, guys. Thanks for listening.
All right. So stay with us right after the music break for Jim Dilettoso. And if you're listening live, go to podcastufo.com. Right over on the right-hand side, you'll see our chat room. It's a quick sign-in, and you can interact with us and the guests coming right up. Stay with us. Well, welcome, Jim. How are you?
Way above average today.
Good to hear that. And we're talking to you all the way down in Arizona, where it's nice and toasty warm. Quite a snowstorm up here today in the cold north.
Another day in paradise.
Yeah. So we're on the eve of the 17th anniversary of the Phoenix Lights, and the timing's perfect to speak to you.
I know. What a coincidence.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, can you tell the listening audience, I'm sure a number of the listeners have seen you on a documentary or two, but you have a background where you look at images and video and things like that. Can you kind of explain how you got into this and how it kind of led to the path of actually researching some UFO images?
Yes. Well, I had a business that I started in the 70s, which was a equipment rental for signal processing and analysis, and I rented out everything from oscilloscopes to waveform monitors in the early 70s before it was fashionable. And a couple years into that, I noticed a opportunity, because I played occasionally with a variety of rock and roll bands and was promoting shows too in the 70s. So I started a touring company in the 70s and really paid attention to it being high-end, really excellent equipment. So I was in that business, Beach Boys, Moody Blues, Steely Dan, and others. And you don't tour in the winter. You look for other stuff to do. So I would rent out my gear, the generators and lights, to the movie business in Phoenix, a couple times to the mining business for special things. And I was approached by a guy from Phoenix that wanted to know if I wanted to do some work on the Shroud of Turin project with a producer named Socrates Ballas. And simple little thing of interfacing one of the test pieces of equipment, the iridium testing, to some display mechanism, whether it would be video or film or whatever. So I took that on, got involved with it, and in that I met a couple people from the Brookings Institute of Photography, noted place out in Santa Barbara, high-end photography teaching, that were on the Shroud of Turin project. And they introduced me to people from Arizona that did UFO research. That was the group APRO. And they said, hey, how would you like to analyze UFO pictures and develop a method for that? And I said, well, I'm kind of busy 10 months out of the year, but let me think about it, and maybe next year. To make a long story even slightly longer, but there was a punchline, I did get involved the following year in approaching it scientifically to research what was out there, what was the issues, and who were the manufacturers and the trade associations, etc., which I could leverage into because of my scientific equipment rental business, separate of my touring business. So there I was in it with Wendell Stevens and Jim Lorenzen of APRO and developed a scientific forensic, basically a forensic method for analyzing objects and extracting data and being able to tell certain things about it. Is it big? Is it small? Is it a distance from the camera? Could it have been superimposed? And as the years went on, I got more involved in that every winter because I added computer graphics and animation to my touring equipment. So a few years into it, I was finding other people that were experts and able to do it myself. Inevitably, I added image processing and image analysis equipment as a product line that I rented out to others and even sold some medium and high-end stuff. By 10 years after that, I put together a group and bought a supercomputer and the graphics that hung on that and started a service bureau for people that wanted to rent high-performance supercomputer time for image processing, image analysis, architecture, film, video, etc. So I had all this great gear and could invite other people to come in and use it and do it myself too. And that's how I got involved with it, with very precise approaches. And, of course, in the UFO community, there was frequently a lot of hand grenade tossing. You merely own a couple of companies and a supercomputer. That doesn't qualify you to analyze pictures. But it didn't matter to me. I mean, I never ever charged for it. So it was something that I and my staff, took it the way we would any project, and we developed ways of analyzing large and small objects, and inevitably leverage that software into aerospace and other clients that we got.
Wow.
So that's the end of my speech. I hope I made a long story interesting.
Good enough. Oh, yeah. Now,
all right.
What was your thoughts about UFOs before you started all that?
I didn't really think about it. You know, I was a Catholic altar boy in Virginia, and then I became a hippie as soon as it was available in the late 60s. Got in the music business. So I was into the things that went along with all that, sort of interdimensional things, the Bardos and the Timothy Leary books, and Be Here Now, and some of the consciousness books were of interest. But I didn't really think about it. And so when I was then really involved with it, it ranged from, you know, this is really interesting and possibly serious business, and all these people are always, you know, the minions built of people being chased by black helicopters and people coming and threatening them and all that. None of that ever happened to me. You know, some people have all the luck. But I took it as something scientific, and that was important. But as we got more and more involved in all kinds of cases, and I started a couple of the organizations like the International UFO Congress. I was Wendell Stevens' resource guy for the first one, and got involved in events and other investigations and just things. The contactees became more interesting to me than the guy that knew the guy that saw the secret report. Mm-hmm. And all that was interesting too, the military people that had stories to tell and all of that. But testing pictures for me was laying a framework to try to understand some things about their technology, their shapes, their how they flew, how they did what they did. What a coincidence that the UFOs have sound and lights, and the Sidhes program in transcendental meditation. If you learn to meditate with the proper sound pattern simultaneously with the proper light pattern, you levitate. They even hand out pillows to people training in TM in the Sidhes program. So those things became interesting and curiosities, more so than, I don't know, than seeing that there was some attachment to our destiny. And inevitably, I came to a conclusion that I thought, or think, that I understand who they are and why they come here and why they hide and what all that is. But the basis of it all is the pictures, and it's really about gathering all of that data about the unknowns, comparing all of them, and figuring out how many of those people are here.
Wow.
What do you think? What do you think? I mean, you talk to people all the time that are investigators and witnesses and all of that.
Yeah, you know.
I'm interested in what you think.
You know, I have as much of an idea as when I started. You know, there's just no answers that have set well with me. We have a question on the board. Have you done any research into the full spectrum photograph analysis? There's Bob Schroeder has done some things with that. And before, I'm going to keep that tabled for just a second. I wanted to ask you, have you kept up with the technology and the software as it has developed over the years?
Well, I have to. I believe I have image processing and image analysis, because what I do now is agriculture and plant technology, and I use very advanced microscopes and image processing for that, as well as keep upgrading the forensic image processing tools that I have. And I've become acquainted with some of the other software programs that are even out there. That fellow in France that released a program for analyzing UFO pictures. I took a look at that. It seemed quite robust and, a real image processing program. I keep track of other stuff. I don't know if I've answered your question or asked and answered my own question.
No, no, that's just what I wanted to know. Thank you. And have you ever done any research in the full spectrum photograph analysis?
When you say full, there's two. Remember, back during the Phoenix Lights, there was a whole hotsy-totsy that went on concerning spectrum analysis, which I was doing then, not to be confused with spectral analysis of stars, not to be confused with hyperspectral, which is special cameras and imaging. There's full spectrum, which is the full spectrum of light analysis and how all that works. And I view full spectrum as meaning the dynamics of FFTs, fast Fourier transforms. But then again, maybe I should have you tell me what it is, because maybe I don't know what you asked me if I'm familiar with, and I'd love to know.
Okay, well, that was from the message board, so we'll wait to see if they have an answer for that. But let's go into talking about the Phoenix Lights, because this is, to me, I think it's one of the, it's a case that if I'm ever debating anyone on UFOs, I've done it a few times. I'm not saying that I'm great at it, but I do try. And the Phoenix Lights is always one of the tools I use, because it's just such an amazing case with so many witnesses. And how can you say that 10,000 people, or how many ever people it was that saw it throughout the state, was seeing something that they could explain what it is?
Yes.
And now,
and
what they come back with is, flares, And sure, there were flares shot off that night, but my thoughts about the flares, and tell me if I'm totally wrong on this, my thoughts about the flares was that it was to distract people from what was going on. Has that ever been looked into?
Yeah, that comes up a lot, but there's a lot of work that we did concerning the flares issue, from comparing flares in controls, flares of a variety of kinds, to the unknowns of that night. There's a real simple tool called a histogram. A histogram measures the amount of red, green, and blue that is in each pixel and the amount of brightness. And you can look at the whole picture or any object in a picture, and you can look at it in a moment of time, if it's a still picture, or one frame of a 30 frames a second video. But if you look at it over time, you look at 2 minutes of flares and 2 minutes of unknowns, and grab the data of the round, shiny object, count the number of pixels, count the brightness, and create an index for that. Create a method for storing round objects that are bright, like indexing the way fingerprints are done, indexing the way that pathogens are done for analyzing, that pathologists do with the microscope. It's pattern recognition. And the flares, whether they're with smoke or not, whether they're moving up and down or not, their brightness, their histogram, called the sigma, frame to frame to frame in a graph over time, it varies. It modulates ever so slightly, and sometimes a lot. Whereas the Phoenix Lights modulate none. Rock solid. So if you looked at it as a graph, the Phoenix Lights, from various witnesses, is a flat graph. 30 frames a second, that's 1,800, 30 times 60, 1,800 frames a minute times 2.5 minutes. That's thousands of frames. But remember, this is 1997, so even though we had really good equipment, frame grabbers, video frame grabbers, the resolution and all that was still almost archaic compared to what $39, $100 graphics cards are now. Right. So we grabbed approximately 1 frame a second and built what's called a sigma delta change. How much does it change? So not only did the flares that we use as controls vary tremendously. We also videotaped, as did a couple of the witnesses, videotape flares all the time, including in the year 2000, a special demonstration of flares that were done by the National Guard. So in addition to that measurement of the optical characteristics, and they're so totally different, there is the measurement of the buried Goldwater Range, how far away it is from the witnesses, for where the lights are in the atmosphere, because the Earth is ever so slightly curved. So how high would the flares have to be that 52 miles away in order to be at a given height compared to the ridgeline and the witnesses? Well, that's 21,000 feet, which we used Maya and 3D Studio Max to model that. I had two different people. In fact, now Larry Lowe's been doing it, fantastic version with Google Earth. Technology has changed. But the point of the story is that that height is far above the range that at the air attack range that the National Guard and visitors and Luke Air Force and Davis Air Force Base are allowed to even fly. They can't fly that high. They're not allowed to fly that high, and they drop flares at about 6,500 feet.
Wow.
Well, here's another part. This is a really good part concerning the flares. About 3 years ago, making it 15 years after the Phoenix Lights, by coincidence, I got a contract to work with a defense contractor in Tucson, Arizona. And what an interesting coincidence that the president of the company was a colonel, high level in the Arizona Air National Guard, and the person who was the commandant of the base at the time was also part of the company. I talked to them regularly. They knew who I was, and of course we talked about it, but talked about it with the professional courtesies that have to go on when we're in that environment. But on one particular occasion, the president of the company told me that the alleged Maryland National Guard position up in the sky that night was, as he put it, bullshit. Can we say bullshit on internet radio, or are we forbidden from saying that?
I think that's illegal. We're going to get shut down any minute. But
all right, I won't do it. Oh man, I'm sorry. I apologize.
Yeah,
I'll keep it under control. So what he said was, because the Maryland National Guard was being trained, and he said a couple of things. He knew for a fact that they were all on the ground, back on the ground at 5:30, because they were all sitting around talking, getting ready to go out and have a couple drinks, and that was it. Nobody was up that night. The following day, when it's on the news everywhere, no one in the Maryland National Guard said one word, like, hey, we were up last night, or, hey, we, the National Guard from Maryland, were asked by the National Security Agency and NORAD to go up and fly a diversionary mission and drop flares 15,000 feet higher than the limit. Yeah, nothing like that was mentioned or said at all. In fact, the base commander got a call from Governor Symington the following day saying, what was that? Find out about that. We got to know. And, of course, we know a few days later that he said he was going to do an investigation, and then a week later he made a mockery of it.
Right, yeah.
But to my satisfaction, the Arizona Air Guard that was up that night with the Maryland National Guard are so convinced that the Maryland National Guard people are making it up, and they don't know what or why, but they know for sure. And you think about it logically. If a diversionary operation was going to be put up, a visiting National Guard would not be the one selected to go up and drop flares.
Good point. Good point.
Others with more experience in these kind of security matters would have been sent up.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, go ahead.
And there is reason to believe that there was more than one event. The big thing was, were the lights above the mountain or below the mountain? And others in the years since then have done some more sophisticated testing with better equipment. And I believe that their results are formidable, that the lights may be right at the ridge line or above the ridge line and drop behind the ridge line. And they could even be some great distance away. But I don't believe that they were a great distance away. The Gila River Indians that live right behind South Mountain and in front of the Estrella Mountains recreated for a few of us, and a Japanese film crew, and a couple of fellows from Bob Bigelow's organization that were down investigating the Phoenix Lights. We were all there behind South Mountain as they, about 50 of them, grandpas, kids, were all there recreating that night 50-gallon barrels with fires in them and them cooking and playing and all running around, and how they came from the south. See, from where they are, that would be, they came from the southeast, diagonally, right up through that valley, flew directly overhead. When they got near the Estrella Mountains, took basically a 90-degree turn and headed towards Luke in the northwest part of the state of Arizona. So that was pretty interesting to have their perspective on what went on that night. Other witnesses, other people who saw it from 8 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, fly directly through metropolitan area, through airspace, fly down to Tucson, turn around and come back. All of that certainly was not flares. So, as some of the current investigators have so wisely done, they have separated the controversial 10 o'clock sighting. Could be flares, could be a setup, could be fake, could be a mistake, from the hour and a half, 2 hours earlier event. It's traversing the entire state, which I think is important to focus on the positive where there is no explanation, frivolous or radical, about what it could be. That's where the real mystery is.
Now, there was
what
also
went on before the 10 o'clock sighting.
Right. Now, there was also a story, and I don't know if it was ever confirmed. I've heard that there was someone that went up, actually flew up to take a look at what it was, and scared the guy to death, and he started to talk about it. This was an Air Force personnel, a pilot, I believe.
Out of Luke, right.
Uh-huh.
Well, the first anyone heard of that was when a person identifying himself as part of the ground crew, an airman, called Peter Davenport of the UFO Reporting Center.
Oh, that's right.
He gave a report that about maybe 9, 10 o'clock that night about what had gone on there at the base, and the pilot or pilots who were up that he was attended to, and how they were freaked out, confused, as were others on the base. The pilot inevitably was identified. His name was provided to me, and I did have 2 conversations with him, each about half an hour. He was more interested in what I knew and other investigators knew than trying to push his story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I gathered that he was in company with others at Luke Air Force Base who did not have an explanation for what had happened and what they had seen. They didn't have a U.S. government or military explanation. They didn't have an in-house explanation. They didn't have a personal or spiritual explanation. They were jarred by it. And the colonel, lieutenant colonel, that I spoke with, a few months later, I was surprised. Someone called and said, "Hey, Jim, turn in Art Bell right now. The pilot who was up that night is on the air calling in," and he didn't give his name, but he called in and spent 7-8 minutes explaining that he was the guy that had been up that night, and that the airman, the quote, the airman that Peter Davenport had talked quite a bit about, that he was the guy. So the idea that there was some kind of military operation or cover-up, they would have said something. Luke would have said something. Even the public information officer, somebody, anybody would have said something the following day. Or would have said, "Hey, it was the Maryland National Guard," or it was Luke Air Force Base. It was something, anything. And the Bill Hamilton, one of the investigators, it was key in the case then, called the public information officer Davis Monson the following day, and he reported that the PIO reported that all planes were on the ground by 8 o'clock, whether they had been out at the gunnery range or at the Florence range or at the Barry Goldwater range, that there were no planes up in the air from any direction after 8 o'clock.
Wow.
So
now I want to talk about the
the
lights in a second, but first of all, anyone who's listening live right now on the Dark Matter Radio Network, if you want to jump over to podcastufo.com, we have a chat room on our sidebar. You can ask questions, interact. It's I think it's a 2-click sign-in. So I want to talk about when you were analyzing these videos, and I guess it was mostly videos of the Phoenix lights, right? There wasn't any actual pictures.
Lynn Kitai had some really excellent 35-millimeter film.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Now, when you were looking at the actual lights themselves, I was trying to explain earlier that they're not like normal lights. They were sort of like amber orange, but they didn't put out light from them. They sort of glowed. What did you find when you looked into that?
There's two situations. One is what people that saw it described, and the other is what the optics of a video camera are able to capture. So the dynamic range, various cameras, and the CCD chip that's in them vary, and are definitely a narrower bandwidth, or a different bandwidth than human vision. You might think of human vision as a 61-note piano, and some devices slide up or down on that to expose themselves to the full 88 notes of a piano, and then some, like infrared or ultraviolet, but no one had ultraviolet cameras out, are a different octave on the piano. So what people would see in the brightness, how bright they would be, in their characteristics are different than what some of the images were that ended up on tape. So the shape and the modulation of the shape, the change, like a light bulb remains fixed and a candle flickers. That's the extremes of this. That the color was not true to what people were seeing, and were subject to the frailties or the conditions of the camera. But the modulation was interesting in them. Now, there's another effect in cameras, and a lot of people know that. If you have it on autofocus or trying to get stars up there, that it'll keep turning into what looks like a Batman going in and out of focus, the Batman wings. Mm-hmm. There's also another thing called looming, which is when a bright light oversaturates the pixels, and it's almost like an explosion temporarily of light. and all of the pixels around it are black. As it gets real bright, that's called blooming. Well, none of the unknowns in the videos that we had, for as bright as the people were saying that they were, we were seeing blooming on any of the cameras. We also were not seeing, when I would compare, and some of them, like the one shot from up on the mountains by the Kristins and Lynn Ketai, there's 700-800 lights in every frame. Street lights, airplane lights.
Wow.
And we grabbed those and gave every single one a name and a number. And for about 300 frames, measured the modulation and the changes of every single light in all those frames. Some of the street lights modulate a little bit because of weather and mist and airplane lights, and they all have their own patterns. The Phoenix lights, the unknown lights, have a real steady graph, real steady for the brightness, and also very steady shape. They're not undulating. They're not flickering. And that was the interesting thing. Now, one other interesting thing. The lights come on like a flare igniting, and then they're on, and then they go off.
Right.
If you build a graph and look at the way the lights come on in a graph, it's like a stair step. It's like someone's got a switch going click, 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 click. And then it's flat. And then when they go out, they don't flicker like a flare or a candle goes out. It's a real conscious. In aviation, it would be called command and control. That it's a stair step. Brightness goes down, levels out for two frames, goes down, levels out for 2 frames, goes down. Curiosities. I mean, I just found that real interesting in what that was and why it was like that.
There's a bunch of questions up on the message board. One that I want to ask right away. I know there's a lot of people waiting for me to ask these different questions, but you? It says right here. It says, didn't you come to change your mind what the lights were? This person thinks they read about that on some website today.
Well, as the years went on and the equipment improved, and we also could redo it ourselves, and not under the gun of hurry up and do this. And the collaboration teams enlarged. There was a few events that happened to recreate the moment of the 10 o'clock event, like from Mike Kristen's house, of are the lights in front of the mountain or are they behind the mountain? And are they at the ridge line? If they're behind the mountain, are they 50 feet behind the mountain or are they 50 miles behind the mountain? So I wouldn't necessarily say I changed my mind, because my mind is always based on revealing what the data shows. And as these other analysis and recreations were done, which I viewed were done with good intentions and good science, that it illustrates that the lights probably are at the ridgeline or behind, possibly and probably behind the ridgeline, as opposed to the view that, they're absolutely in front of the ridgeline and lower than the ridgeline. So I viewed that the science that was done by Ken Liljegren in Spectrum Video and Larry Lowe with Scott Davis, who's now at Channel 5, was done without an axe to grind. They weren't trying to go there and prove it one way or another. They were doing an event of something that was still at issue. So that's the way that I view that now, is that what they did was valid, and it showed that the lights are not absolutely in front of the mountain and lower than the ridgeline.
Okay. Well, I know you mentioned that earlier, so we don't have to really dwell on that. Have you ever looked into some of the older, the older photographs? We have a person that was asking about two different things. One of them was the Lubbock lights. I'm not even probably pronouncing that.
Yeah, a few of them. When I first got involved in the late 70s and developing a method for APRO, they had a set of 40 pictures that was their official APRO UFO picture set. So we used those as our first round to analyze for size and distance and create principles around it. And over the years, I've looked at lots and lots of pictures because of the amount of time, months, years, in calendar moments I spent with Wendell Stevens, retired Air Force colonel, who was a colorful character and a reliable UFO investigator with a world's largest collection of UFO photographs. So I analyzed a lot of them, I cataloged them, I digitized them to archive them, and they're now owned by John Rayo and Open Minds, and they've done a really good job of preparing them for their longevity, so to say. So I've looked at a lot of them. And, when you have copies of copies of copies, you have what you have. You want to have originals, but depending on what you have, you can gather a lot out of it. One of the things that we started doing on copies of film or slides that we would get was analyzing the film grain in between the sprockets in the film. Because if something was superimposed, we would find evidence of superimposed grain in the image area and a different grain pattern out in between the sprockets in the film. So that was one technique for trying to find things. We went to Hollywood special effects people like Wally Gentleman and Linwood Dunn and Hollywood Effects Company and other experts in that to get their view, their opinion, their techniques. We went to government contractors. We went to software and hardware big shows like SPIE and really found out what was going on so we could apply it to some of the older pictures and some of the new ones. But there's a lot of people out there now that are really good at this. I mean, they're really diligent at looking at pictures and studying it and coming up with things that, we hadn't seen before.
Right. We have only like 4 minutes left, and I feel like I have a ton of questions to ask you. But, and I'm sorry I can't have you on longer. Perhaps you can come back at some point. But, I want to talk a little bit about the triangle crafts because a lot of that's been coming up lately.
Yeah.
And, they always seem to be absolutely huge. They're talking about, of course, the Phoenix Lights. Some people were suggesting it was a mile or larger. And and then other people that I have talked to that have seen them, they all say the same thing. Huge. Just plain huge. Right. So what do you think is, if you had to speculate, the first thing that I think of course, is that, it's probably extraterrestrial, but, I don't really know. But, is that kind of along the lines of what you think they possibly are?
I think that they possibly are. And here's what it would be. The laws of physics apply to everyone. Even if you got here in a time machine or an interdimensional place-hopping machine or rode on gamma bursts of radiation or jumped into a black hole and came out of quasar or whatever, once you get into our atmosphere, the Venturi effect rules. Wings, you take a piece of wood, push it off the top of a building, it falls to the ground. You curve that front and arch the top so that the ratio is correct, and you're lifting. So however people would get here, if they've got a mission or they need to be here a while, they would make something that was a combination of the grand scale that they needed and also had the principles of wings and lift built into their flying machines that maybe have some kind of plasma fusion engine, but the wing is the wing. So that's my take on it. If it is extraterrestrial, it's because they're flying around in our atmosphere, and they could probably cloak and hide and do whatever. But if they're going to move around, they can use that cool little thing, the Venturi effect. Let's fly.
Yeah. There's speculation. Have you ever heard of someone on the chat room has mentioned a number of times, Robert Schroeder. Have you ever heard his take on their propulsion? It's
no.
Yeah,
no. I'd like to hear it.
It's very
if
interesting.
You like it, I'd like to. Can you give me the elevator pitch version?
No.
Okay. Email me later. All right.
I will. It's just it would be too.
You have smart people listening to your show, smart and creative. They ask good questions. They know about stuff that even Jim Dilettoso doesn't know about. Holy smokes.
You almost said the SHIT word again.
I know I did, but I stopped myself.
You stopped yourself. Good. Hey, where can someone find you, or can they find? How did I find you? Yes, I got your email through Dr. Lynn, actually.
Yeah.
Good time.
I'm on Facebook and I'm on LinkedIn, although I don't harvest names on Facebook, and that's not how I do things, but I have a real easy email that I've had for a decade. It's the last four letters of my name, Toso, Jim Dilettoso. So it's TOSO at cox.net.
And, we only got, 30, 40 seconds left. But where do you think this is going to, it's too long of a question to ask you.
So, no, I can answer that.
Okay,
I got it.
All right.
I've been thinking about this for decades. I think that there is not a government cover-up.
Okay.
I think that if the aliens didn't want there to be a cover-up, there wouldn't be one.
Wow.
For some reason, the prime directive, or they're going to cook us and eat us later, or they're going to observe us. But I think that if we did disclosure, that the ETs would be a no-show. And for some reason, they are curious in our free will, in our ability to go from a pimp to an avatar, not that being a pimp is all that bad, to a spiritual being in one lifetime. We've got creative capacity and all these marvelous things in one package that makes us almost the best in the universe, and we've run amok. We've run amok, and they're here trying to figure out if we can save ourselves.
Well,
so I think
that's a great closing, Jim, and we'll have to have you back. So we're plumb out of time. Thanks so much for joining us. And
happy to be on. I'd like to meet some of your smart listeners sometime.
That's great. Okay.
And thanks for having me on, Martin. It was a real pleasure to meet you.
You bet. Well, that's it.
Okay.
That's it for our show today. If you missed any part of this show, you can catch it as a podcast and a whole bunch of other free podcasts on our website, which is podcastufo.com. You can also check out our links in the stories and our show notes, as well as joining in the conversation in our forums. I want to give a quick thank you to all the people that help us out, and for Keith Rowland, producer for the Dark Matter Radio Network, Andy Fleming for the Astronomy News, John Tobin for the UFO News, Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse for our music, and Peggy Shunning. She was on the message board again. Thank you for managing our Facebook page. And remember to like us on Facebook for all the latest UFO news. You can check us out live here next week, right here on the Dark Matter Radio Network, and every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to jump into the chat room at Podcast UFO. Well, this is Martin Willis reminding you to keep your eyes to the sky.